The McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks in February, and not far from the Gardner place they brought down one very peculiar individual. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered, while its face had a lopsided look they had never before seen in a woodchuck. The boys were scared. They threw the body to the side of the old road, so that all that remained of it was their grotesque tail. But the shying of horses near the Gardner house was a reproducible phenomena, and young men would come to challenge each other merely to ride past the place. People swore that the snow melted faster around the Gardners than it did anywhere else. Early in March there was a half-whispered discussion surrounding the wood stove in Potter's General Store. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's that morning and had seen the skunk cabbages coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never before had he seen cabbages of such size, and they were off color. Also, their scent was unusually odorous. Several other persons drove past, just to gawk at the abnormal growth. They all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in healthy soil. There must be poison in the ground. Of course, this was caused by the meteorite. They remembered how strange the men from the college had found that stone to be. One of these farmers brought the matter to them. So they paid Nahum another visit, but having no love of wild tales, were very conservative in what they surmised. The skunk cabbages were certainly odd, but the entire species was more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it should soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, this was mere country folklore, inspired by the meteorite. Superstitious rustics would believe anything, and thus for all the strange days yet to come, the professor stayed away in contempt. At the Gardner place, the trees budded prematurely. Nahum's 15-year-old son Thaddeus swore that the trees would sway. Restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed a habit of stealthy listening for a sound they could not or would not name. When listening did not occupy their thoughts, consciousness itself seemed to slip away. It was said that something is wrong with the Gardner folk. When those plant species came out early, which grow wild in the cracks of rocks, their flower also bore a strange color. Nahum took some of these blossoms to Arkham, showing them to the editor of the Gazette, but that reporter did no more than pen a humorous article, in which dark fears were held up to impolite ridicule. It was Nahum's mistake to tell a city man that these flowers had been pollinated by mourning cloak butterflies, which themselves were monstrously overgrown. April brought madness to the country folk. They began to avoid the road past Nahum's lot. What led to its ultimate abandonment was the vegetation. All the trees of the orchard blossomed forth with strange pigmentation, and through the stony soil of the yard and the pasture sitting adjacent, there sprang forth a growth so bizarre that only a botanist could have identified the flora of that area. No sane or wholesome pigments were anywhere to be seen, except in the green of the grass and the new leaves of the trees. Everything else was dominated by those hectic and prismatic variations, and the bloodroot grew insolent in chromatic perversion. Amy and the Gardners recognized that these colors were hauntingly reminiscent of the tint of the brittle orb found inside the meteor, Nahum plowed and sowed his 10-acre pasture and his upland lot, but could do nothing with the land around the house. It was no use. He hoped the strange growth would draw the poison from the soil. The shunning of his house by the neighbors took its toll on him, of course, but it seemed a heavier burden for his wife. The boys were better off, being at school each day. However, they were frightened by the schoolyard gossip. Thaddeus Gardner, an especially sensitive boy, suffered the most. In May the insects came, and Nahum's home became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. The nocturnal habits of these creatures contradicted all their former traits. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions. It was young Thaddeus who first noticed something unusual about the surrounding trees. He pointed from the window at the swollen boughs of a maple, silhouetted against a moonlit sky. The tree limbs were moving, but there was no wind. One day a timid salesman of windmills, in ignorance of the local gossip, was driving down the old road past the Gardner place. The word he spread in the town of Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette. It was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark, and the salesman's buggy lamps were faint. But around Nahum's farm, the darkness seemed less thick. A dim luminosity was emanating from the encircling vegetation, and one particular lump of phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in Nahum's front yard. The cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house, and toward the end of May no more use could be made of the milk they produced, which had turned bitter. Nahum drove the cows to the uplands, after which their milk again turned sweet. Not long after this, the grass and the leaves in the area of the homestead began to take on an ashy gray appearance, and a quality of brittleness, somewhat like the brown leaves of autumn. Amy was now the only person who ever visited, and his visits were becoming fewer. When school closed for summer, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, sometimes appealing to Amy to run their errands in town. The health of the gardeners was failing, both physically and mentally. No one expressed surprise at the news that Mrs. Gardner had gone mad. This happened in June, near the anniversary of the descent of the meteor. Mrs. Gardner grew fearful of unidentifiable things in the air around her. She said these things twisted and fluttered. She complained of being drained by them. Nahum refused to send her to the asylum, allowing her to wander about the house. But when the boys grew afraid of her, Thaddeus being horrified at the mere expression on her face, Nahum made the decision to confine her to the attic. By the following month, she had lost the power of speech, and she crawled on all fours. And before July was over, Nahum discovered that his wife's skin was slightly luminous in the dark. The very next day, the horses stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in the stalls could be heard from the house. Nothing could be done to calm them, and when Nahum opened the barn door, they all bolted forth en masse, like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track down all 8 of them, and thereafter they were unmanageable. Something had snapped in their intelligence. All 8 beasts of burden would have to be shot. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for the purpose of taking in the hay. The new horse declined even to approach the barn, which presented a problem because its loft was where hay was stored. The animal shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end Nahum could do nothing but get the wagon as close as possible to the barn, unhitch the horse, and ask his sons to help him move the heavy wooden vehicle near enough to the hayloft to be able to pitch the hay. As the surrounding vegetation continued to perish, even the flowers whose hue had been so strange were now turning gray as well. Instead of yellow, the goldenrod bloomed with the color of an old man's white hair, and the roses in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Zenas, the oldest boy, cut them down. The odd-looking insects also began to die. The honeybees abandoned their man-made hives, abandoning their queen, and flew away in hundreds of different directions into the dark of the surrounding wood.